$1.74 billion in debt, $21 million recovered. That is about 1.2 cents on the dollar. This is the story of how you bankrupt a 106-year-old American company and quietly keep its brand alive, and exactly who designed it that way. In February 2026, Eddie Bauer, the company that put down jackets on the backs of Everest climbers and Antarctic explorers, filed for bankruptcy for the third time, and this time there was no rescue. It was liquidated. When the company was put up for auction, 2026 potential buyers were contacted. 2 were interested. Not one of them made a real offer. And yet, and this is the part that turns a sad retail story into something stranger, the Eddie Bauer brand did not die. You can still buy an Eddie Bauer jacket today, because weeks before the company filed for bankruptcy, the most valuable part of it had already been quietly carried out the side door into the hands of the people who would keep collecting on the name long after the company that built it was gone. So this is not really a story about a 106-year-old brand that failed. It is a story about how you separate a brand from the company that carries it, so that when the bill finally comes due, the name walks away clean, and only the part with the debt and the workers and the stores is left to burn. To see how that was built, you have to go back to the beginning, to a tailor in Seattle. In 1920, a man named Eddie Bauer opened a sporting goods shop in Seattle. He was an outdoorsman and an inventor, and in the 1930s, he patented something that changed cold weather clothing forever: the quilted, goose-down, insulated jacket. It was not a fashion item. It was survival gear. During the Second World War, his designs kept American airmen alive at altitude. In the decades that followed, Eddie Bauer outfitted the first American expeditions up the highest mountains on Earth. When climbers reached the top of the world, they were wearing his jackets. Think about what that does to a name. You cannot manufacture that kind of credibility. You can only earn it, jacket by jacket, mountain by mountain, decade by decade. A brand like that is a promise made to the customer before they even walk in the door, that what you are about to buy was built by people who understood cold and risk and the outdoors. That promise is worth money. It is, in fact, the single most valuable thing the company ever made, more valuable than any store, any warehouse, any season's inventory. And unlike a store, a promise like that does not wear out. It can be sold. It can be moved. It can outlive the company that made it. Remember that, because it is the hinge the whole story turns on. That is a real brand, not a logo invented in a marketing meeting, but a name earned over decades on actual mountains. By its peak around 2001, Eddie Bauer had grown to close to 600 stores and roughly $1.7 billion in annual revenue. For generations of Americans, it meant the same thing: the rugged, dependable outdoors in a storefront at the mall. It was woven into the country. So hold that in your mind. A century-old name, built on trust, worth real money precisely because people believed in it. Because that trust, that belief, is the asset this entire story is about. Not the stores, not the inventory, the name itself. And the people who would eventually take Eddie Bauer apart understood something the rest of us rarely think about. A brand, and the company that runs it, do not have to be owned by the same hands. To understand what happened in 2026, you have to understand the move that happened years earlier, the split. Eddie Bauer had already been through hard times. After decades under the catalog company Spiegel and a 2009 bankruptcy of its own, it was bought by a private equity firm, Golden Gate Capital, for $286 million. Then in 2021, it changed hands again, and this time the way it changed hands is the whole story. It was acquired by Authentic Brands Group, together with a retail operating partner, and they did not buy it as one thing. They split it in 2. Here is the mechanism, because it is the engine of everything that follows. One company, Authentic Brands Group, took the intellectual property, the trademark, the name Eddie Bauer, the logo, the designs. That is all it took. It does not run stores. It does not hire salespeople or sign leases or hold inventory. It owns the name, and it licenses that name out to whoever actually sells the product in exchange for a fee. A separate company took the operations, the roughly 300 stores, the employees, the warehouses, the landlord obligations, And to use the name Eddie Bauer on its own stores, that operating company had to pay licensing fees up to the brand owner. If that sounds abstract, make it concrete. Imagine two people buy a famous restaurant together. The first person takes only the name on the sign and agrees to rent that name back to the second person for a fixed amount every month. The second person takes the kitchen, the staff, the lease, and the debt and has to cook every meal, pay every cook, and still hand over that fixed check for the right to keep the sign lit. Now imagine business slows down. The person with the kitchen is in trouble immediately. The person who owns the sign, they get paid the same as ever, and if it all falls apart, they walk away still holding the one thing everybody recognizes. That is not a partnership. It is a structure with a built-in winner and a built-in loser, decided the day the papers were signed. Now here is the catch that matters more than any other sentence in this story. That fee is fixed. It is owed in the good years and the bad ones alike. When sales are strong, it gets paid. When sales collapse, it still gets paid. First, before the operating company can catch its own breath, the brand always gets its cut. The operating company absorbs all the risk. One side of this deal can lose. The other side was built so it almost can't, and for a few years that imbalance stayed hidden because the stores kept the lights on. But one of the deal's original players had already done the math. In 2022, 4 years before the end, Simon Property Group, the shopping mall giant that held a stake in the Eddie Bauer brand, traded that stake for equity in Authentic Brands Group itself and stepped back, quietly. No press conference. It swapped a piece of the thing that could fail for a piece of the thing that collects the fees and never fails. The people who structured this understood something the stores did not yet know. So keep that in mind and watch what happens to a company when the smart money has already found the exit. First, watch what that fixed fee does to a business that is starting to struggle. The operating company carried everything heavy: the stores, the staff, the leases, and a debt load that climbed to $1.74 billion. On top of all of that sat the licensing fees owed upward to the brand owner, a cost that never paused no matter how the business was doing. In January 2025, the operator was folded into a larger entity called Catalyst Brands, the merger of an apparel group with the department store chain JCPenney, a bigger ship carrying the same leak. And the leak was structural, not seasonal. Eddie Bauer was not selling badly because people had forgotten it. It was being slowly bled by a cost that took its cut off the top no matter what the stores did. A retailer can survive a bad year. What it cannot survive is a bad year stacked on top of a fixed payment that does not care whether the year was bad, plus the interest on more than $1.5 billion of debt it had been saddled with. Every dollar that came through the register already had a line of people ahead of the company itself, waiting to be paid. By late 2025, the math finally broke. The operating company could no longer cover those fixed licensing fees. Its parent stepped in with roughly $215 million in intercompany loans to keep it breathing, and then made a decision. It stopped. The funding was cut off, and once the money stopped flowing into the part of the business that held all the debt, the ending was no longer in question. Only the timing was no longer in question. Only the timing was. And what happened in that final month is the part you need to see clearly. In January 2026, 1 month before Eddie Bauer filed for bankruptcy, the brand owner moved Eddie Bauer's e-commerce business and its wholesale licenses into a brand new company called Outdoor 5. Read that again, slowly, because the timing is the entire confession. The online store and the wholesale deals, the parts of the business with the steadiest, most valuable revenue, were lifted out and placed somewhere safe. Weeks before the bankruptcy, the profitable organs were transplanted into a healthy body, and the dying shell was left with what nobody wanted: the physical stores, the leases, the workers, and the $1.74 billion of debt. In the court documents, this move is framed in the language of savings, a way to cut costs by ending obligations. But look at what actually happened, and to whom. The valuable, ongoing parts of Eddie Bauer survived. The part that was about to file for bankruptcy was carefully emptied of everything still worth having. First, that is not a company failing. That is a company being field-dressed before the funeral, which brings us, finally, to the receipt. On February 9, 2026, the Eddie Bauer Operating Company filed for Chapter 11 in New Jersey, its third brush with bankruptcy in 23 years, the second filed in its own name, and its last as an independent operating business. In March, it went to auction. Of the 126 buyers contacted, 2 showed any interest at all, and not a single qualified bid arrived. There was nothing left to bid on that anyone wanted. The good parts were already gone, so the stores were liquidated. Against $1.74 billion of debt, the wind down recovered $21.3 million of debt. The wind down recovered $21.3 million. About 1.2 cents on the dollar. Now read the receipt out loud. Who came out ahead? The brand owner kept the trademark, the one asset that was never a risk, and remains free to license the Eddie Bauer name to a new operator tomorrow. Simon Property Group, as we saw, had already swapped its Eddie Bauer stake for equity in that very brand company back in 2022. Out, cleanly, 4 years before the collapse arrived. The private equity firm that sold the business in 2021 had cashed out long before. At every level, the people who held the name, or a piece of the company that held the name, found a way out before the fire. And who paid? The workers across the 224 locations that were wound down. The store managers and salespeople who had spent years, in some cases decades, representing a name they believed in, and who learned their stores were closing the way everyone learns these things now, all at once near the end. The trade vendors, the suppliers who shipped product on credit, trusting a 106-year-old name to be good for it, who were left to split roughly $2 million among all of them, and the lenders who had backed the operating company, who recovered pennies on what they were owed. Everyone whose stake was tied to the company that did the actual work absorbed the loss. Everyone whose stake was tied to the name got out. That is the anatomy of this collapse, and it is not the story of a brand that stopped being loved. People still buy Eddie Bauer. The name still means something. That is exactly why it was worth protecting, and exactly why it was worth protecting, and exactly why the protection went to the name, and not to the company, or the workers, or the century of history behind it. A brand built over 106 years on real mountains, by real people, was split from its own body so that when the end came, the valuable half could simply step over the wreckage and keep going. The jacket is already back on a shelf somewhere, under a new license, with the same famous name stitched on the chest. The company that earned that name is gone, and almost everyone who designed it that way is just fine.